The Remley estate stood at the edge of the fog-drenched woods, its weathered timbers and slate roof unremarkable to the casual traveler. Yet those who approached closely noticed the hush that clung to its walls like a living thing. Locals would pass by and feel the air thicken as if the house itself exhaled a quiet warning, a stillness that pressed against the chest without a single visible cause. Elias Remley was the master of this silence, a man whose outward piety and measured gestures earned nods from ministers and magistrates alike, whose sermons praised the household as an example of devout Christian order. Beside him, Matilda moved with the same careful grace, her hands folded over her apron, eyes cast demurely, her presence a mirror to the patriarch's social polish. To the world they were a respectable couple, guardians of their estate, stewards of the community. Behind closed doors, however, their lives revolved around a pattern of control and observation that twisted every heartbeat into something darker, something precise, almost clinical. The hallways of the house were themselves instruments of the family's temperament, each corridor scrubbed to a sterile perfection, each piece of furniture aligned with such care that any disturbance would have seemed sacrilege. The floors gleamed under the muted light of tall windows, yet beneath the shine lingered a faint metallic odor, subtle enough to be dismissed by those not trained to notice it, a scent that hinted at preservation, of substances meant to arrest decay, of bodies prepared to endure beyond their natural span. Servants whispered of missing children, of small ones who arrived with the dawn and vanished by nightfall. Their absences explained away as illness or the providence of God, explanations accepted with bowed heads and muffled sorrow. Rumors circulated in hushed tones, never confirmed, yet growing heavier with each passing season, like the fog that rolled off the distant river and gathered around the estate's gates. No one ventured into the house uninvited, and yet the fear of what might lie within colored every exchange with the family, every polite greeting exchanged with measured smiles. Within the main study, Elias collected his tools of observation with the devotion of a scholar, not a sadist. Anatomical drawings, carefully reproduced from European texts, lined the walls in meticulous rows, detailing the fragility of infant bodies, the mechanics of breathing, the arc of the heartbeat. Alongside these, bound volumes of alchemical treatises chronicled the properties of herbs, oils, and distillates, substances capable of prolonging life, arresting death, or numbing pain. Every page was annotated in Elias's precise hand, notes that recorded minute observations with the clinical detachment of a surgeon, yet the fervor of a believer, as if each child were both a vessel of divine instruction and an object of scientific curiosity. He measured pulse, skin, and muscle, tone with the patience of a craftsman, plotting the subtle differences between one child and another, cataloging responses to temperature, sound, and light with a methodical precision that brooked no error. Matilda assisted quietly, her hands steady and her expression serene, repeating the motions of care with a fidelity that belied the terror they enabled. In the nursery, the air was too still, the toys too neatly arranged, the blankets folded with such symmetry that even the smallest disruption would have seemed unnatural. The children, few in number but carefully observed, were watched not with tenderness but with expectation, as though each movement, each gasp, each flicker of attention were data points to be recorded, interpreted and stored. There was no laughter here that did not carry an echo of fear, no comfort that did not carry the weight of observation. To outsiders, the Remleys embodied the virtues of propriety. To those who lingered too long in the shadows of the estate, the truth was unmistakable. The silence was not peace, it was a cage. Even the neighbors who observed only from the misted edge of the woods sensed it. A quiet that pressed against the bones, a hush that spoke of a mind hidden behind the mask of civility, a mind that had learned to operate without witness, unchallenged, invisible. And in the study, Elias Remley continued to trace the delicate lines of human life, compiling knowledge with a devotion that would have seemed miraculous had it not been soaked in dread. His obsession a shadow that stretched through the house like a slow, inexorable hand, reaching into each corridor, each nursery, each silent crib until every breath was accounted for, every heartbeat recorded, and every child destined to vanish as methodically as the morning mist, dissolving into the Maine fog. Every birth at the Remley estate followed a rhythm both sacred and terrifying, a cycle that Elias had imposed with a precision that left no room for mercy or accident. From the first cry to the final hush, each newborn was treated not as a child, but as a specimen, an object through which Elias could study the mechanics of life and assert dominion over its fragile arc. Matilda assisted with quiet competence, her hands steady as she cleaned and swaddled the infant, her expressions carefully neutral, masking the dread she had long since normalized. She moved as one might in a church service, ritualizing care to hide horror, performing gestures that reassured the servants and obscured the true nature of the family's obsessions. Elias took the infant into his own hands, measuring limb length, noting skin tone, cataloging the curvature of fingers and toes, checking reflexes with the meticulous eye of a surgeon and the fervor of a zealot. Each observation was recorded in bound journals alongside sketches of hearts, lungs, and the smallest veins, annotated with Latin terms and references to obscure anatomical treatises, a lineage of thought tracing back to the Royal Society's investigations into life, death, and the occult. Among his most prized influences were the anatomical experiments of King George I's court physicians, whose curiosity had danced along the line between science and superstition, probing life and mortality as if they were willing servants to knowledge. Elias revered these figures, imagining himself continuing their work in secret, refining their techniques, controlling the cycle of life within his own walls. Central to this obsession was the coffin, a single ornate vessel crafted to both preserve and confine, its interior lined with polished oak and delicate engravings, yet small enough to restrict movement completely. Each newborn was placed inside with care, wrapped in linen soaked in distilled oils and herbal emulsions derived from Elias's compendium of alchemical formulas, substances meant to arrest decay yet prolong consciousness, a cruel balance that tethered life to observation. The children's bodies were not simply hidden away, they were displayed within this private theater, a ceremonial space in which Elias could study the fleeting pulse, the last tremors of breath, and the silent surrender of muscles to death. Living children were taught through subtle suggestion and fearful observation to witness without question, to see the cycle as divine instruction. Siblings watched as another was placed in the coffin, their young minds absorbing terror alongside the careful lessons of piety and obedience, believing that these acts were expressions of God's will. Though each ceremony etched fear into their marrow and taught the mechanics of helplessness, Matilda's role was to soften the edges, to lull the eyes of the onlookers from horror to acceptance, her hands brushing over the linen, her voice a quiet cadence of comfort. Yet even in these moments she understood the truth, that she was complicit, her silence a mechanism of control, her care a mask for the methodical cruelty of her husband. Elias's interest in preservation extended beyond mere observation. It was an assertion of dominion over mortality itself. He experimented with combinations of herbs known for their sedative and antiseptic qualities, oils distilled from resins and chemicals derived from rudimentary distillation manuals, blending them into tinctures that he applied to the infants before sealing them in the coffin. Each preparation was logged with care, every dosage recorded, noting the infant's responses as if the child were a subject in a scientific trial. The air in the room was heavy with the scent of oils and herbs, pungent and clinging, an invisible witness to the ceremony of life being methodically extinguished and preserved. With every burial, the ritual reinforced Elias's belief in cycles. Life, death, observation, preservation, repetition. He saw patterns in the movements of muscle and the flutter of eyelids, interpreting them as divine signals or the secrets of human design, proof that control over life was attainable through study and method. To the outside world, the Remleys remained pious, respectable, even charitable. Servants whispered of the family's odd insistence on order, of children who seemed quieter than nature intended, yet no one suspected the full scope of Elias's obsession. Within the walls of the estate, horror was normalized, celebrated in the guise of devotion and codified as a process of learning, an education in obedience, fear, and the careful administration of life and death. Every act of preparation, every measured touch, every deliberate observation reinforced the silent terror that pulsed through the household, shaping the minds of children and adults alike. The coffin was both altar and laboratory, a crucible of Elias's ideology, a space where the living and the dying intersected under his methodical gaze. And as each infant was placed within, as Matilda's hands smoothed the linen and Elias recorded the tremors of the heart, the estate exhaled its quiet, a hush that hid the machinery of cruelty and preserved the facade of normalcy, ensuring that every cycle of life, every birth, every burial served only the relentless order of his design. Beyond the polished corridors of the Remley estate, beyond the orderly parlors and the hush of pious conversation, lay a garden that seemed at first glance nothing more than a cultivated display of wealth and taste. But every path, every hedge, and every tree carried a weight that only Elias understood, a grim codex of life and death mapped onto the living landscape. Each sapling, each twisted vine corresponded to a child, a cipher of birth and demise marked with symbols so subtle that they escaped the notice of even the most attentive visitor. A slender branch carved with tiny notches, a patch of moss arranged with unnatural care, a circle of stones placed just so. All were entries in Elias's private ledger, a garden that functioned as both sanctuary and archive, a catalogue of human fragility disguised as aesthetic devotion. Some plants were exotic, imported with painstaking effort from the collections of Dr. Hans Sloane and other learned men of science, curious specimens whose leaves contained poisons and stimulants, herbs that could dull sensation or induce tremors. Elias walked among them like a scholar in a laboratory, inhaling the faint odors, observing reactions to the slightest touch, and noting how light, wind, and moisture affected each specimen's growth. These botanical acquisitions were not mere ornamentation. They were instruments in the exercises that gave his obsession form. Infants, wrapped tightly in linen cocoons imbued with aromatic herbs and oils, were placed under trees or along garden paths, restrained in a manner that dulled sensation yet heightened awareness of minute changes. A sudden ray of sunlight, the rustle of leaves, the faintest bird song became stimuli to which he recorded responses with meticulous precision, noting tremors, shifts in breathing, and flinches of skin. The garden's beauty became an apparatus of controlled terror, each living element intertwined with death, observation, and ritual. Servants tended the plants and cleaned the paths, their hands careful, their faces expressionless, their silence both protective and fearful. They had glimpsed children bound and laid beneath branches, infants whose tiny cries were muffled or absorbed by herbs. But the fear of Elias's scrutiny and of the unknown punishment kept them mute. Their steps in the gravel carried the weight of what they had witnessed, a constant, unspoken dread that seemed to settle into their bones and remain there, as if the garden itself had drawn the terror into its roots. On occasion, visitors arrived under polite pretenses, merchants delivering rare seeds, local magistrates inspecting estates, even clergy summoned for blessing or counsel. But they never saw beyond the superficial charm. They admired roses and magnolias, noting the symmetry of the hedges and the fragrance of lilies. And yet none discerned that each choice of flora, each curve of path and arching bower marked life and catalogued death. Elias moved among these outsiders with practiced grace, smiling, explaining the virtues of exotic plants, concealing the garden's grim utility beneath lessons of botany and horticulture. Within the shadowed spaces of tall hedges and narrow rows, infants were subjected to the same methodical scrutiny as in the house. Elias tested the limits of sensation, exposing the restrained children to extremes of temperature, subtle shifts of air, or sudden bursts of sound. He noted reactions as carefully as he recorded anatomical measurements, translating fear, discomfort, and startled movement into data, as if emotion itself were a substance to be distilled. The psychological impact on the children was immense. Some learned quickly to remain still, to mask panic, their small bodies and minds adapting to the imposed terror as though it were natural. The older siblings watched from the garden edges, learning through observation that life and death were instruments for study and devotion alike, their understanding shaping their own obedience, fear, and the quiet acceptance of ritualized cruelty. Matilda moved through the garden at intervals, her presence a balm on the edges of horror, offering a hand to steady a trembling child, smoothing linen of the cocoons, her eyes betraying none of the revulsion she had long contained. Even she, however, could not deny the relentless precision with which Elias orchestrated these exercises, nor the way that methodical cruelty imposed itself upon the household like an invisible structure of iron and glass. The garden became more than a collection of plants. It was an ecosystem of fear, a living map of mortality, a silent record of Elias's obsession. Trees bent slightly under the weight of understanding that only he possessed herbs, quivered with the energy of lives constrained and observed, and the paths whispered with the invisible tread of dread. Servants, children, and even the household itself moved through this space with a suspended tension, aware that every leaf, every stone, every carefully pruned branch was a witness and a participant in rituals of study, preservation, and terror. And yet to the casual eye it remained a garden of refinement, a testament to wealth and knowledge, hiding methodical evil in plain sight. The interplay of beauty and horror, of botanical care and experimental terror reflected Elias's philosophy. Control over life demanded patience, observation, and the silent orchestration of suffering, and in the careful, unmoving hush of the garden. He found a space where death, research, and ritual coexisted, shaping both the victims and the witnesses alike. Beneath the polished floors in the fragrant halls of the Remley estate, behind a concealed panel in the study lay a chamber that breathed with quiet menace. Elias had converted the basement into a laboratory that was both alchemical sanctum and theater of death, a space where science and ritual intertwined with a precision that unsettled the air itself. The walls were lined with shelves of glass jars containing fragments of infants preserved in fluid whose clarity belied its purpose, a slow-moving archive of anatomy and obsession. Bell jars glistened atop tables enclosing small experiments of tissue and bone, while distillation sets hissed and dripped, their copper coils winding into cauldrons darkened with the residue of repeated heating, the faint scent of herbs and minerals lingering like incense of dread. Elias moved among this apparatus with the calm detachment of a man performing devotion, drawing small amounts of liquid into graduated cylinders, noting changes in hue, viscosity, or clarity. He was both priest and scientist, his Latin-inscribed notebooks capturing observations, measurements, and diagrams with the precision of a cartographer charting an unknown land of sensation and mortality. Infants were brought into the chamber in linen bindings that restricted their limbs while leaving faces exposed, and Elias observed every micro-expression, every shiver, every involuntary twitch, translating fear, confusion, and physical response into codified knowledge. Herbal sedatives infused the air in controlled doses, slow and insidious, dulling consciousness just enough to make suffering prolonged but not chaotic. Layers of mild hypothermia were imposed, chilled stones under blankets, windows ajar to invite the chill of Maine's fog-laden air, and the children's reactions were logged with relentless accuracy. The smallest shift of breath, a subtle widening of eyes, a tense curl of fingers became data points, a cruel alphabet of sensation that Elias translated with the same care he gave to his botanical studies. Occasionally, rewards of warmth or a gentle touch followed a measured response, and at other times the lack of touch, the absence of comfort, became the punishment for a twitch or cry, training the infants in a grim language of cause and effect, conditioning their minds as much as restraining their bodies. The room itself was arranged with ritualistic care. Candles flickered in geometrical patterns, their soft light reflecting against polished glass, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move with purpose. Elias's movements were precise, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Lifting a jar, adjusting a coil, or noting a reaction became part of an unbroken choreography of observation and control. He had studied the work of Count Alessandro di Cagliostro, the arcane alchemist whose obsession with mystical transformation bordered on obsession with human experience, and he drew parallels between these esoteric practices and the experimental logic of contemporary physicians who tested children for physiological responses. Every act of cruelty was embedded with intent, every observation a step in an art form only he could decipher. The chamber's floor bore the marks of repeated meticulous cleaning, yet stains of oils, tinctures, and the faint coppery residue of blood lingered where cauldrons had overflowed or where experiments had been placed. Even the air seemed measured, a balance of warmth, chemical odor, and the quiet murmur of observation, designed to maintain a calm that belied the suffering contained within. Servants rarely entered, and when they did, their steps were hesitant, their eyes averted, their silence heavy with terror and complicity. They had seen infants shivering in bindings, watched as Elias monitored reactions with an almost loving attentiveness, and yet the methodology, the precision made the horror feel sanctioned, almost natural. Matilda, when summoned, performed small gestures of care, straightening bindings, whispering words of comfort, maintaining an illusion of maternal compassion while the reality of ritualized cruelty persisted. Elias catalogued every detail with Latin annotations and diagrams that suggested both mystical symbolism and anatomical study, as though death and suffering were instruments for a divine and scientific purpose alike. The room became an extension of his mind, a reflection of how methodical evil could operate under the guise of reason, knowledge, and devotion. Each experiment, each act of measured cruelty reinforced his belief that mastery over life required observation, restraint, and the patient orchestration of terror. Infants emerged, altered in their behavior, quiet, compliant, their minds shaped by the chamber's rhythm of control and fear, a silent testament to Elias's calculated artistry. In this subterranean sanctum, horror was not chaos. It was precision, a slow burn operation of cruelty in which every detail mattered, every reaction was recorded, and every life was a page in a living ledger of obsession. To an outsider, the basement would appear as no more than an eccentric scholar's laboratory. Yet the careful observer would note the subtle tension in the air, the faint odor of chemicals entwined with herbs, the silence of children whose bodies and minds bore witness to ritualized torment. Here, beneath the estate, Elias Remley perfected his philosophy, that control, method, and measured cruelty could transform the act of killing into a disciplined, almost sacred practice, a terrifying fusion of science, ritual, and artistry that left both victim and observer ensnared in the web of his obsession. Samuel Hawthorne had lived near the Remley estate all his life, a young physician respected in the town for his keen eye and precise hand. Yet he had always considered the family untouchable, their piety a shield against the murmurings that slipped from servants' lips or neighbors' hesitant confessions. It was during a routine call to examine a child on the edge of illness that Samuel first noticed the faint, persistent odor seeping from the estate's lower windows, a chemical tang that pricked at the senses in a way both unnatural and oddly familiar. The house appeared immaculate, as it always had, yet the hush that clung to its halls, the slow-footed movements of the servants, and the strangely precise alignment of furniture suggested more than mere pride in appearances. Records he had been asked to inspect contained subtle anomalies. Sudden absences of infants, birth records that stopped mid-page, marginal notations in a careful, almost clinical hand that made him suspect there was more to the family's domestic life than devotion and routine. Samuel began to observe, noting the Remley children, their small bodies bundled with unnatural care, their eyes sometimes blank, sometimes flickering with a terror no child should possess. He marked in his own ledger the small details Elias might have considered inconsequential. The peculiar mixtures that lingered in glass flasks visible through curtained windows, the minute traces of embalming fluid that colored the edges of laundry and wood, and the hushed rituals of the servants who, when questioned, only smiled nervously and shifted their weight. Words caught in the throat. Samuel's knowledge of anatomy and preservation, grounded in the work of William Hunter and other contemporaries who had studied the human body to map life itself, gave him the tools to see patterns others overlooked. The notes he took were careful and clinical, recipes of herbal tinctures and early chemical preservatives, lines connecting infant deaths to ritualistic timelines, diagrams that suggested deliberate restriction of movement and exposure, as if observation alone were a form of dominion over life and death. His own moral center was tested as he considered approaching Elias, a man whose public demeanor radiated virtue. When Samuel finally broached the topic in polite conversation, mentioning his interest in anatomical preservation and infant mortality, Elias's response was a masterclass in deflection. Gracious smiles, erudite discussion of natural philosophy, and subtle shifts of focus towards Samuel's own professional studies. It was impossible to accuse, impossible to confront directly, yet impossible to ignore the pattern emerging before him, a creeping truth that each measured death, each carefully documented preservation of the children, was part of a rhythm entirely orchestrated by Elias. The horror was methodical. Samuel found himself returning at odd hours, walking the edges of the estate under pretense of consulting a sick neighbor, eyes and senses straining to capture the small deviations from normalcy. The faint outline of a coffin beneath a hastily closed door, the odd layering of cloth and herbs, the echo of measured cries muffled by walls thick with intention. Each observation weighed heavily on him, a slow accumulation of moral and emotional pressure that left him sleepless and haunted. He began to see the Remleys' domestic life as a performance, a societal mask under which a precise, almost surgical cruelty took place, cruelty so calculated that the town, bound by politeness and deference, could not conceive its existence. His notes grew extensive, each line a fragment of a puzzle he could neither piece together fully nor safely present to authorities who trusted in appearances. Samuel became a silent chronicler, an invisible witness forced to inhabit a moral limbo between knowledge and impotence. He catalogued not only the physical traces of death and preservation, but also the emotional residue, the blank, obedient faces of surviving children, the servants' trembling hands, the tension that vibrated through each polished surface of the estate as though the house itself anticipated discovery. Slowly he began to understand that Elias's power was both psychological and societal, that methodical cruelty could exist entirely beyond legal reach when wrapped in respectability and devotion. Samuel's own reflections turned inward, each entry in his ledger a struggle against despair, horror, and the urge to flee. For leaving might allow the cycle to continue, yet intervening without proof would be suicide of reputation and career. Observation became ritual, his moral conscience forced to mimic the patience and careful attention that Elias applied to the infants, a perverse symmetry that heightened the terror and fascination in equal measure. By the time Samuel had accumulated enough small details to recognize a pattern, a ledger of loss, a map of absence, the faint chemical traces in the air, he realized that the Remley estate operated on a principle entirely alien to ordinary morality. Evil, when executed with meticulous order, could remain invisible, untouchable, a silent force encoded into the rhythms of daily life. And so he recorded, watched, and waited, a lone conscience moving within the shadow of methodical horror, the first witness to a system of cruelty that combined observation, ritual, and preservation in a dance both horrifying and impossible to interrupt. Each day at the estate reinforced the slow-burn truth. Society might see only order and piety, but beneath the polished veneer, Elias Remley orchestrated death with the precision of a master. And Samuel Hawthorne was the reluctant keeper of this secret, the invisible scribe of a carefully concealed nightmare. The estate had grown quiet in ways that were not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of an oppressive attentiveness that weighed on every room, every corridor, every polished surface that reflected both light and dread. Elias Remley's rituals, once confined to the privacy of the alchemical chamber and the hidden coffins of newborns, now spread like a silent contagion into every corner of the household, a methodical choreography of control and observation. He had begun to train the surviving children with precision, each lesson designed to harden, to fracture, and to bind them to his will. The infants who remained were forced into rigid observation, seated on small benches lined with aromatic herbs and soft cloth to deaden discomfort, eyes wide, bodies restrained but not violently so, allowed to witness the embalming of their siblings as if horror itself could be turned into a catechism. Each act of preservation, each immersion of tiny bodies into perfumed fluids was conducted with slow, deliberate movements, with Elias's meticulous Latin notes documenting reactions. The flicker of an eyelid, the curl of a finger, the gasp or lack thereof. These observations were not merely for his own satisfaction, but a form of psychological conditioning, an early experiment in shaping obedience through grief. The children learned quickly that terror could be a language, and that participation in silent observation was both expected and sacred. The infant's small hands, when able to gesture at all, hovered over chalked geometric patterns Elias had drawn on the floors of the chamber. Patterns designed to record their movements, their instinctive attempts at escape or expression, mapping what he believed to be the soul's behavior against the rigid order of mathematics. Each twitch and flinch, each tilt of a head or turn of an eye was meticulously recorded in a ledger alongside measurements of temperature, the tinctures used, and the precise duration of exposure to light and sound. The act of witnessing death became a ritual of its own, a grotesque interplay of fascination and terror. With Elias at once the conductor and the silent audience, his obsession both scientific and mystical, a devotion that blurred the boundaries between devotion, cruelty, and art. It was not enough for the children to be passive. They were made to internalize their own complicity, to feel guilt at their survival and fear at what might come next. Each infant understood through instinct and repetition that to resist, to cry or to look away too quickly could disrupt the rhythm of the household and bring consequences far beyond the immediate. The servants, trained over years to anticipate the precise timing of Elias's rituals, moved with a quiet efficiency, their faces masks of learned detachment. Yet their eyes betrayed the weight of witnessing, their silence a reflection of the suffocating power the patriarch wielded. Outside the chamber, visitors arrived under the pretense of Christian piety. Distant relatives, clergy seeking favor, merchants and minor officials whose curiosity was carefully curated and satisfied with orchestrated displays of the family's devotion. None perceived the subtext of horror, the subtle traces of preparation, the faint chemical tang in the air, the perfectly aligned benches and herbs, the invisible tally of lives reduced to observation and fluid samples. Each gathering was a performance, a grotesque theater of methodical cruelty, the estate itself a stage upon which Elias demonstrated not only mastery over life but also over perception, shaping reality so that horror could exist and yet remain unseen. The ceremonial extraction of fluids inspired by historical figures like Paracelsus was conducted with surgical precision. Small incisions and carefully measured distillations designed to test reactions, record humors, and preserve physical evidence, all under the guise of advancing knowledge and piety. Children learned the rhythm of these actions as they learned prayers, internalizing the oscillation between grief and obedience, terror and reward, their emotions codified into predictable responses, their bodies instruments of both observation and conditioning. Matilda, silent yet present, facilitated these rituals with an almost maternal efficiency, her hands steady as she guided the infants into place, applied soothing touches where necessary, and ensured that every detail reflected Elias's designs. In these moments, care and cruelty were indistinguishable, the psychological architecture of fear meticulously layered atop outward signs of domestic normalcy. Over time, the household culture solidified into one of silent terror. Every glance could carry judgment, every pause could signal failure, and every breath was an acknowledgement of the omnipresent observation that structured daily life. The children's small faces, pale and expressionless, became a mirror of the household's methodical evil, and yet in their eyes lingered the faintest trace of incomprehensible grief, a spark of recognition that this horror was deliberate, patterned, and inescapable. Elias watched, recorded, and adjusted, a craftsman of psychological torture, each ritual both a scientific experiment and an artistic expression of absolute dominion. His obsession with observation and control, leaving a trail of methodical devastation that would echo far beyond the chambers, beyond the estate, and into the fragile minds of all who bore witness to the meticulously orchestrated suffering within the Remley household. Magistrate Arthur Lovell approached the Remley estate under the weight of civility and social expectation, a man trained to navigate the precarious balance between law, propriety, and the pervasive deference owed to families of wealth and influence. The carriage rumbled over the gravel driveway, and Lovell could not help but note the immaculate order of the gardens, the precision of the hedges, the outward signs of a family devoted to God and public duty. To the casual observer, the estate appeared as a testament to refinement, discipline, and Christian virtue, and in this lie of appearances Elias Remley thrived. Lovell had been made aware of discrepancies in parish records, infant deaths registered under curious circumstances, and the sudden disappearance of children whose births were officially noted yet whose later presence in the household went unrecorded. He had also detected faint chemical odors, pungent, sweet, and unsettling, emanating from certain areas of the estate. Yet each time he raised a question, polite deflection met him, a veneer of cordiality designed to assuage curiosity. He was a cautious man, socially conscious to the point of paralysis, wary of scandal that might reflect upon the local courts or, by extension, his own standing. Here the tension between duty and decorum created cracks through which the Remleys' malevolence flowed freely. During his visits, Lovell noted the children's behavior, their faces too still, their eyes too observant. But he dismissed his unease as the natural consequence of a strict household. He observed servants moving with mechanical precision, their silence and attentiveness both unnerving and socially explicable as loyalty. The Remleys presented a tableau of moral propriety. Charity carefully administered to the parish, donations to the church, and regular attendance at Mass, all of which masked the dark experiments conducted behind locked doors. Every act of outward kindness was calibrated to maintain a perception of innocence, and in the rigid social hierarchies of the 18th century, this perception often carried more weight than truth. Lovell's notes, which he kept meticulously in a leather-bound ledger, reflected a mind caught between suspicion and convention. He catalogued anomalies, the recorded infant deaths, the odor of exotic herbs not used in cooking, the occasional sight of children in a trance-like state following rituals whose purpose he could not discern. Yet each entry was accompanied by the implicit question: how far could one pursue certainty without jeopardizing reputation or inviting scandal that might reflect poorly upon the local magistracy? In this vacuum of action, Elias Remley's genius for social manipulation became a weapon as effective as any of his alchemical or psychological devices. Lovell encountered Elias in the drawing room, the patriarch's charm precise, his politeness deliberate, his laughter calculated to disarm discomfort. There was a rhythm to these encounters, a performance of civility and deference that placed the magistrate in a position of passive observation rather than intervention. Every inquiry Lovell attempted was met with gentle deflection or eloquent elaboration on the family's piety, philanthropy, or the supposed fragility of the children, creating a narrative in which caution and politeness became complicity. The magistrate left the estate each time with a growing unease that he dared not fully articulate, haunted by small observations. A subtle bruise on a child's wrist, the faint chemical smell lingering on the air after a brief tour, the way a servant's eyes flicked toward hidden doors, as though acknowledging the secrets they could not speak aloud. Legal precedent offered him little leverage. 18th century statutes afforded families vast autonomy over their households, and infant deaths, tragic though they were often dismissed as misfortune or natural frailty. The combination of societal respect, fear of scandal, and lack of concrete proof created an environment in which even the most diligent magistrate could do little. Elias understood this intuitively, conducting his rituals, his embalming, his psychological manipulations in plain sight, knowing that charm, reputation, and ostensible faith would blind any observer trained to see only what society permitted. Lovell's ledger became a silent testament to the invisible horror. He recorded, he questioned, he theorized, yet he acted not. His moral conflict intensified with each visit, a slow burning agony as he reconciled the reality glimpsed in fleeting, suggestive moments with the social and legal framework that constrained him. By the time he departed after a third formal call, the estate had achieved something close to invulnerability, the horror thriving beneath the masks of civility, the careful rituals and meticulous observations of the Remleys flourishing because society, in its polite adherence to form and fear of scandal, allowed it to do so. In plain sight, methodical evil advanced, and the magistrate, a man of law, faith, and conscience, remained a witness without recourse. His ledger a chronicle of restraint, his silence a quiet echo of complicity imposed by circumstance, decorum, and fear. Dr. Abigail Fenwick arrived at the Remley estate under the guise of routine consultation. Her presence initially welcomed as a professional courtesy by a family that understood how appearances could mask truth. She was a woman of remarkable focus and quiet authority, her gaze trained to detect the smallest irregularities, the subtle signs of distress that others dismissed as inconsequential. The estate had long carried an intangible unease, a lingering tension that seeped through polished floors and immaculate gardens. But it was in the dim, locked spaces beneath the house that she would uncover the reality of Elias Remley's obsession. Descending the narrow stairs to the hidden basement, she found herself surrounded by the instruments of a methodical and grotesque intellect. Bell jars filled with preserved parts of infants, fluid still clear yet tinged with the faint amber of long-settling formaldehyde, cauldrons blackened with obsidian residues, early distillation apparatus, and alembics that smelled faintly of bitter herbs, all arranged with deliberate precision. On tables, anatomical sketches in Latin sprawled across parchment, diagrams of humors and esoteric symbols intertwined with the meticulous records of pain and observation. The charts detailing movement, respiration, and even micro-expressions as if the infants themselves had been unwilling participants in a scientific theater. Each page was a testament to Elias's ability to rationalize cruelty as both necessity and artistry, every act of suffering encoded in meticulous script. Abigail moved with calm scrutiny, her hands gloved and her mind cataloging, confirming and shuddering simultaneously at the extent of the orchestrated horror. She recognized the methods employed. The slow inhalation of sedatives combined with slight hypothermia. Restraints designed to immobilize yet allow observation, and conditioning intended to instill terror and obedience. Each act perfectly aligned with a mind that believed cruelty could reveal the architecture of the soul. When confronted, Elias emerged from the shadows with the measured calm of a man who had rehearsed confession 1,000 times, his voice neither trembling nor pleading but deliberate, rationalizing every act as divinely inspired and scientifically necessary. He spoke of understanding life through the lens of death, of mapping the unseen currents of the human psyche and spirit, and of elevating observation to the level of sacred duty, each statement layered with a chilling sincerity. Abigail listened, recording every word, aware that the confession was both a release and an additional instrument of manipulation, designed to frame horror as purpose and cruelty as enlightenment. The impact of the revelation spread rapidly beyond the walls of the estate. Local clergy debated the extent to which faith had been twisted to serve obsession, their sermons oscillating between calls for moral reckoning and attempts to rationalize what they could not comprehend. The community, once blind to subtle cues, was shaken to its core. Neighbors who had casually observed the Remleys' outward piety now confronted the reality that the cultivated appearance of virtue had masked systematic cruelty. Legal proceedings were initiated, yet the ambiguity of 18th-century statutes regarding child welfare and family autonomy complicated the pursuit of justice, leaving a residue of frustration, grief, and moral ambiguity that would linger long after the trials concluded. Abigail's observations, journals, and testimonies became an irrefutable chronicle, a methodical account that forced society to confront the consequences of silence, deference, and the allure of appearances. Through her lens, the public understood that the horrors inflicted were not the result of uncontrolled frenzy, but of calculated artistry. A deliberate orchestration that transformed death into both spectacle and instrument of control. In the aftermath, the estate stood as a monument to the capacity for human reason to be warped into cruelty and for a community to be blinded by respect and ritualized civility. Elias, stripped of the protective veneers of wealth and social grace, faced scrutiny for acts that had long been obscured by his outward charm. Yet his mind remained a study in cold, meticulous obsession, a man convinced that every measured infliction had a purpose, every scream a data point, every death a step toward understanding that would, in his mind, transcend the ordinary bounds of morality. Abigail left the estate carrying the weight of both horror and duty, her methodical documentation a bulwark against future erasure, an insistence that society acknowledge its complicity and the fragility of its moral attentiveness. The Remleys' house, once a place of hidden torment, had been rendered visible, and in that revelation lay a reckoning not only for Elias, but for every observer who had looked and looked away, whose blindness had allowed methodical evil to thrive in the ordinary spaces of daily life, beneath the comforting guise of piety, propriety, and social deference. The Remley estate, once a secluded symbol of wealth and propriety, became a mirror in which society glimpsed the quiet persistence of calculated evil. Newspapers, hesitant at first, began reporting the horrors with an almost clinical tone, detailing the preserved infants, the alchemical instruments, and the meticulous journals in which Elias had recorded every measured act of cruelty. Their accounts were not sensationalized but precise, cataloging the grotesque methods of conditioning, the symbolic mapping of movement, and the cold arithmetic of death, as though society needed the exactitude to comprehend the depths of depravity that could hide behind charm, piety, and inherited privilege. Editorials debated morality, the blind complicity of neighbors, and the systems that had allowed such methodical suffering to persist unchecked. In the quiet hours of ink and candlelight, legislators and moral philosophers wrestled with the ramifications, the words of Abigail Fenwick and Samuel Hawthorne serving as evidence that evil was not always a wild storm, but often a slow, deliberate rot, working silently in spaces assumed to be safe, spaces cloaked in civility. Pressure mounted for systemic reform, for documentation of child mortality in private households, for oversight where previously the law deferred to the unspoken authority of family and social standing. Physicians were urged to maintain precise records, Chemical experimentation was placed under scrutiny, and the earliest frameworks for child protection began to take shape. A hesitant recognition that methodical cruelty demanded methodical vigilance. In the gardens of the Remley estate, where once roses and boxwood had been arranged to signify taste and lineage, visitors began to see symbols of mourning and memory. Trees were whispered to mark where the youngest had fallen, shrubs pruned with care to echo the geometry that Elias had once employed in his maps of behavior. The estate became a site of pilgrimage, not for celebration but for reflection, a physical embodiment of the cautionary principle. That horror thrives in plain sight when society's attention is divided by respect, deference, and assumptions of normalcy. Communities far beyond the estate's immediate neighbors found themselves forced to reconsider the invisible structures of cruelty, the ways in which routine obedience, politeness, and silence could be weaponized into a system that trained fear, guilt, and compliance into its youngest witnesses. Survivors of the household, now dispersed, carried within them both scars and memories that spoke to the psychological weight of observation. Their minds cataloging each act, not as random misfortune but as deliberate instruction in obedience and dread, shaping personalities in ways no one could legislate against. Philosophers and moralists wrote of the Remleys' crimes as evidence that evil could be methodical, almost architectural, a structure built of repetition, ritual, and silent complicity, and that it thrived precisely in environments assumed to be safe, ordinary, and morally upright. The debates reached even academic circles. The rationality behind cruelty, the interplay of observation, measurement, and emotional conditioning, and the terrifying revelation that one mind, disciplined and undeterred, could create a microcosm of suffering whose effects radiated outward into culture, law, and memory. Memorial services were held for the lost children, small ceremonies with readings and symbolic gestures acknowledging not only the deaths but the lessons to be drawn from them, that society must remain vigilant against the quiet persistence of malevolence. Historical reflection painted Elias not merely as a singular monster but as a cautionary lens through which future generations would examine institutional neglect, familial secrecy, and the seductive power of outward virtue masking inner corruption. The estate's walls, once instruments of secrecy, now served as silent testament, a grim architecture of warning reminding every visitor that the most dangerous evil often operates without fanfare, without screaming accusation, and without immediate consequence, flourishing where attention is divided, where the ordinary is trusted without question, and where human empathy is deferred in favor of social convention. Across town and across generations, the psychological imprint of the Remleys' methods endured. The understanding that cruelty can be systematic, that observation can be weaponized, and that communities must confront the uncomfortable recognition that the ordinary may conceal the extraordinary capacity for harm. In this reflection, both horror and societal awakening intertwined, leaving behind a legacy not of sensation but of methodical insight, a chilling reminder that evil, patient and precise, does not announce itself with thunder but whispers in patterns only careful observation can detect, and that vigilance, record-keeping, and moral attentiveness are the only defenses against its quiet, persistent advance. The Remley estate, once alive with the rhythms of a family household, had long since become a repository of memory and horror, a silent testament to the deliberate and ritualized cruelty of Elias Remley. Every act he had conducted, measured and precise, was etched into the very fabric of the estate. The basement where infants had been preserved in chemical baths, the chalked geometric patterns that once guided their small bodies like instruments of observation, the journals detailing extraction of bodily fluids to study reactions, each page a record of methodical obsession disguised beneath a veneer of piety and social propriety. These were not acts of impulse or rage. They were orchestrations of a mind that treated death as data, fear as instruction, grief as a mechanism to shape obedience. Children had been conditioned from their earliest moments to witness the deaths of their siblings, to internalize guilt and terror, to obey without question, and in so doing the estate itself became both classroom and prison, the architecture of horror designed to imprint trauma into the psyche with surgical accuracy. The horrors were quiet, almost imperceptible to the outside world, and therein lay the brilliance of Elias's malevolence. That in ordinary, polite society, beneath the trappings of wealth, charitable acts, and Christian devotion, evil could proceed unchallenged, spreading its influence in silence and stillness, embedding itself in family rituals that appeared innocuous to the casual observer. Each chemical vial, each precisely annotated chart, each spatial arrangement of bodies and observers was a note in a symphony of methodical destruction, and yet the house's outward appearance, flowers, polished floors, dinner parties, hymns sung on Sundays, ensured that the world beyond the walls remained blind, unaware, and complicit through inattention. The archives and memorials that followed the exposure of the estate's atrocities revealed the extent of societal failure. Legal historians now recounted the ambiguity of 18th-century family autonomy, the limits of municipal oversight, and the social weight that allowed a man like Elias to operate without consequence. Scholars noted that the silence maintained by neighbors, the polite deference of magistrates, the fear of scandal among the clergy were all instruments in the perpetuation of suffering, tools just as essential to Elias's methods as his instruments of observation and chemical preservation. Modern parallels became unavoidable. Reports of institutional failures, hidden abuse, and systematic cruelty echoed across centuries, reminding readers that the human tendency toward politeness, respect, and avoidance of discomfort could mask devastation on a scale both personal and structural. Just as the Remleys had weaponized silence within their household, society's broader culture of discretion and civility could serve as a cover for malevolence, a quiet complicity that allowed horror to metastasize where attention was diverted and norms of decorum prevailed. Observers of history were forced to confront the unsettling notion that the mechanisms of evil had not vanished with the Remleys, that the architecture of methodical cruelty was timeless, adaptable, and dependent upon the failure of those around it to question, observe, or intervene. Psychologically, the lessons of the estate lingered in the minds of all who had come into contact with it. Samuel Hawthorne, once a young physician recording observations in fearful secrecy, had learned that morality could be a burden when exercised alone. that witnessing evil without power to intervene could imprint a lasting dread that reshaped perception and response. Dr. Abigail Fenwick, brave in her examination and documentation, carried the weight of the preserved infant's silent testimony. The chemical smells, the carefully catalogued cruelties into her work and her conscience. Understanding that memory itself could be both weapon and shield, an inheritance of horror that demanded acknowledgement to prevent recurrence. The surviving children bore the heaviest burden, their bodies and minds trained to obedience through trauma, their memories haunted by every act of measurement, observation, and ritualized suffering. Yet their existence also served as evidence that the patterns of methodical cruelty could be broken through exposure, reflection, and communal recognition. Even today, the Remleys' legacy provokes moral unease, a persistent question hanging in the air. Can such quiet, deliberate cruelty re-emerge under the guise of normalcy? The very structure of society, reliant upon assumptions of propriety, politeness, and respect for authority, becomes the potential incubator of evil's resurgence. Observers are forced to ask themselves how many households, institutions, or organizations might harbor similar systems of silent, methodical oppression simply because social attention is divided, because ordinary appearances are trusted, because historical memory fades or is selectively ignored. The estate, its memorialized trees, and the meticulous records left behind function as both warning and mirror, revealing the duality of human nature, the capacity for both moral vigilance and passive compliance, the thin line separating ordinary life from systematic horror, and the chilling truth that evil rarely announces itself with fanfare but persists in the quiet corners, the subtle manipulations, the unchallenged authority. The Remleys' methods, horrific in their historical specificity, also serve as a philosophical caution. That evil's most dangerous weapon is silence, that devastation can thrive where curiosity and moral courage are absent, and that remembrance is both a duty and a defense. Communities must engage in careful observation, record-keeping, and moral attentiveness, not merely as rituals of commemoration but as tools of prevention. Society's complicity, even unintentional, is the framework upon which methodical cruelty can build, and the task of confronting it is ongoing. For history demonstrates that human nature, institutional inertia, and social politeness can combine to shelter malevolence until the next opportunity arises. The estate whispers across time, a haunting testament to precision, control, and silence, leaving an enduring question for those who bear witness. What remains hidden in the quiet, the ordinary, and the socially accepted, and how vigilant must we be to prevent the recurrence of horrors carefully concealed beneath the surface of daily life? What do you think? Could this happen again? The Remleys' legacy suggests that the answer is neither simple nor comforting, leaving a lingering dread and moral unease that persists long after the last memorial has been laid and the estate has returned to silence.